So let's give it a few minutes for the attendees to join. And Andrea, the floor will be yours in about 2-3 minutes.
Say it again, sorry.
Said the webinar is now live. We'll give the attendees a few minutes to join and the floor will be yours.
Yeah. Who's missing? Oh, here I can see Sohail. Ciao, Sohail.
Hello. Hi, my friend.
Hello. How's it going in Wyoming?
Good, good. The weather is getting better here.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Let me try to call Alexander. All right, folks, we have some attendees starting to join. We have most of our panelists. Let's give it maybe a minute or two, and we'll kick this event off.
Oh, Eric, maybe Alexander is in a little confusion. It's worth being given the mail because he's trying to access Google Meet. He's trying to access Google Meet maybe on the
Okay.
on the placeholder.
I've just re-pushed the his invitation out. Let me push it again.
Yeah, please do. Try to call him.
Yeah, I just did. It went to voicemail.
Ciao, Alexander.
Hello, Andrea. Hi, Eric. Hi, everybody.
Oh, there you go. All right, awesome. All right, Andrea, I think the floor is yours. Let's kick off this event.
Yeah, well, just a few words, introductory ones. Second meeting, welcome everybody, by the way. This follows up the one that we had between Europe and North America on March 17th. It was about food production and blockchain space. So it's great to have you here today. We're going to have a wonderful panel on ESG and climate change, by the way. So, I mean, I'll leave it into you to give a few words, Eric, about what we are doing and what BFCA is to let people understand much better what we are doing.
Thanks, Andrea, and thank you very much for putting on this event. His brainchild, his initiative, a lot of work to put on the great panel that we have. So I'll make this very brief. I am Eric Veliket. I'm the CEO of the Blockchain Supply Chain Association. The name kind of says it all. We are about mobilizing the supply chain world using blockchain. Yes, it's kind of buzzy, but the distributed ledger technology, blockchain technology is very powerful. And we do what we can. So let me give you a quick brief. Our brief is to help supply chain transform itself. We've been doing business the same way for centuries, moving papers around physically or via email. And I think the industry has seen, because of the pandemic, that we are due for something new. And we think that blockchain is here to help. What do we do at the association? We basically do three things. We do some advocacy work. So we talk with the governments and the governing bodies of the world. We actively work on establishing standards and policies. We have a few areas around that. We also do collaboration. So we get involved in projects. If you have a blockchain project in your supply chain, you need resources, we are here. We have the blockchain experts, we have the industry experts, we have the supply chain experts as part of our members. So if you're looking for help, we are here, and yes, we do get involved actively, and we introduce people to each other. It's all about the community. It's all about the network. Whoops, and before I move on too fast, yes, we do education through different factors, through our newsletter, through webinars like this, through different workshops, and we even have a micro-credential in partnership with CITT. Hi, Pina, I know you're there. I had to mention that. So we do offer courses for the supply chain experts that want to understand blockchain. We have a beautiful ecosystem. We have a beautiful community. Again, I did mention governments and governing bodies. Of course, we would be nowhere without the folks from industry, learning, so other universities and other associations, of course. The logistics world, the people who, like me, have no hair and carry stuff around the planet on a daily basis. Trade finance, right? We need to pay the bills for all this freight that we're moving. And of course, the technology folks. We are definitely and very proud to be technology agnostic. So if you're on Hyperledger, if you're on Corda, if you're on Ethereum, if you're on any platform, we love you. So come and see us. And finally, a few of the benefits, and we'll be sharing these slides, but it's about the community. It's about putting people together. We started our life about 3 years ago here in Canada. I'm in Montreal myself. Beautiful discussions back then, but these discussions have taken a global footprint these days. We're opening chapters around the world. We have one, thank you, Andrea, in Europe, South America, North Africa, India, Australia, New Zealand, and we're in discussions on a few more, so stay tuned for that. So that is pretty much about the association. If you want to learn more, of course, we have our website, we have our LinkedIn pages. Reach out to us over email anytime. We are always happy to help. So that's my quick speech. I hope I kept it short enough for you, Andrea, and the floor is back to you.
Yeah, but it's gonna be pretty quick on my side. You see, I think people attending meeting are more interested in seeing the rest of the speakers, and I will introduce the very first one. It's great acquaintance. You see, though, for those who know about my activity within the Hyperledger former trade fund SIG, it kicked off year 2022 this year with a wonderful speech on ESG and trade funds. So I leave stage to Mr. Alexander Malaket from Toronto, Canada, to step in and kick off the meeting today, officially delivering the very first speech. Alexander, please step in, stage is yours. I'm glad to hear from you.
Wonderful, Andrea, and thank you, Eric. Thank you both for the invitation to join you today. Delighted to be here. I guess I'll share my screen here and just throw the slides on screen. And hopefully those are visible. And I have the task this morning, ladies and gentlemen, of spending about 15 minutes with you to set the stage on what ESG is. And I have just a couple of messages that I'd like to leave you with around this. It's a complicated area. It's nascent and evolving. There are still, from my perspective, more questions than answers, but it's absolutely critical. And it's, it's, as I'll say in a moment, it's far from an option at this point. It's an absolute requirement. Just to give a bit of context on this, my partners and I in our ESG practice out of London wrote a white paper in 2019 on this, and we put this in the context of what we call a historical arc. So for us, ESG didn't suddenly pop up out of nowhere. You can trace some roots of the ESG thought process and community evolution and priorities and all the things that have flowed from that back to the environmental movement, through the CSR, the corporate social responsibility time period that we went through, link it directly to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Now, in my head, the way I've reconciled this is the UN Sustainable Development Goals sit above as an umbrella, and ESG kind of sits underneath that as a kind of a subset of the SDGs. But we can debate whether that's the case or not. It just kind of makes some sense to organize it that way. There is a link to this business of the triple bottom line and thinking about more than just profit maximization and financial reporting. There's a clear linkage and increasingly visible one around the social license to operate that companies and corporations get or don't get, or maintain and don't maintain. And that can be true of a multinational corporation as well as of an SME. And then clearly this kind of development around stakeholder capitalism, which is thinking about capitalism and commercial performance in the broader context, thinking about all the stakeholders that are involved directly or indirectly in a business and its ecosystem. So all of those pieces connect to frame the ESG conversation. And just to put a bit of a figure in the frame here for our conversation, there's an estimate by Bloomberg that by 2025, there will be something like $53 trillion in assets under management that are ESG or sustainability aligned, which represents roughly 1/3 of the capital that's flowing globally. So just to give a sense of how significant this is. In terms of the nascent character of this and the fact that it's relatively new, there are discussions, literally you can Google this, around whether it's ESG, environmental, social, and governance, whether it should be GES, meaning we get the governance right and everything else should flow logically from that, whether it's E plus S plus G, and whether you look at them as three sort of silos and separate elements. And then recently I had an interesting discussion with a group saying, actually, we need another E, which is the economics. So we need to keep in mind the environment, the social aspect, the governance aspect, but we need to also think about the economics and the commercial aspect of things in the private sector dynamics of this whole business. Regardless of this, one thing that's clear is any graphic that you pick up around ESG these days is showing a growth trend line, and there's no question of that, almost no matter how you measure it. A couple of things to sort of highlight for you is this whole business of the rigor around ESG, the question of whether it's a greenwashing, whether it's a marketing exercise, whether there's real substance behind it. And that's where I think blockchain can have a very significant role in enabling transparency and visibility on this. And, you know, the questions about definitions and data quality and data access. And I'll just say one thing on that is that as of 2016, according to an OECD report, there were something like 125 different rating scales and systems in the world to try to measure ESG aligned activities, behaviors, and commitments. And I'll say more on that in a moment. But before we get into that in a bit more detail, let's just highlight again that this is not an option. This is absolutely critical. You know, we know about the issues of temperature, and I'll just say one takeaway from me in a recent discussion was that if the global temperature gets to a certain level, and that's the one we're trying to sort of prevent the 1.5 to 2 degree increase, if it gets to a certain point, the entire planet becomes uninsurable. So just imagine the consequences of that for your businesses, for, you know, all the government services and facilities that we have access to through our taxes. I mean, you just can't insure anything at that point. So it's catastrophic, right? I want to just say one thing on climate, and climate change is getting a lot of visibility for a lot of good reasons. As I mentioned earlier, there's this arc of history that goes back to the environmental movement. So it's a much more mature conversation, but the climate discussion happens in a context. And I want to just highlight, for example, and normally I would do this with a show of hands, but there are too many people on at the moment. And I'll just ask you rhetorically, how many of you buy clothing? How many of you buy food? And how many of you have some kind of technology at home, whether it's a phone, a smartphone, a computer, a laptop, you know, a notepad, whatever it is? If you answered yes to all three of these questions, I can tell you from a colleague, and I know, Pina, you'll recall this from the course that we took together recently, who works in the space, that with those three activities, we know that there are 38 to 40 cases of human trafficking in your personal supply chain. So this is very significant, very real, and very human. So I want to just really highlight that for people. There are huge reputational and other risks involved in ESG, particularly getting it wrong. And there's a whole conversation we can have around the difference between a carbon tax and a carbon price, specifically in the climate and environmental space. And from my perspective, carbon tax is a politicized sort of turn of phrase or language to discuss this, to make it controversial and to create the optic that it's a tax of some version or other. And on the political spectrum, I read a line recently from somebody saying, so-and-so, like any good conservative, as a small c conservative, hates the carbon tax because it's a tax, right? And if you're on the right, towards the right end of the spectrum, you're supposed to be sort of anti-tax and more sort of driving capacity into the private sector. The reality for me is that it's a carbon price, and it's really about understanding the costs of production and making sure that all of the elements, including the climate impact elements, are priced in appropriately. So I think that changes the conversation very, very significantly. We can have a talk, and I know there's somebody later on who will bring a perspective from Africa, where I'm from, so I have a perspective on that as well. But we can talk about the just transition piece and whether it really is just and equitable and correct, or whether it's gone off the rails and whether we need to rethink it a little bit, particularly in the way that we engage with emerging markets on this whole ESG conversation. On the rating scales, just to illustrate, out of that same 2019 report, and I go back to it even though it's a couple of years old now, it's one of the most comprehensive, thoughtful, and objective reports I've seen that lays out the landscape very, very well. But one of the things it does is it highlights that you can be like Microsoft, or you can be any of these other sort of companies that are listed here, Verizon or whomever, and that you can sit literally across the spectrum of ratings, from the very worst performer to the very best performer, depending on which rating scale you choose. And so you can imagine how untenable and illogical that is. So I want to just highlight that as a reality. Another flavor of this is a piece that Bloomberg did recently on how to get an ESG rating upgrade. And the headline is a bit eye-catching. The findings of the article are actually even worse in a sense, because what Bloomberg concludes is that the rating scales and systems are actually rating the wrong thing. So where you might expect that the scales are rating how a company performs against its ESG commitments and ESG standards that you might apply, so that you can rate, okay, Microsoft is very ESG aligned and they're doing well and so on. In fact, what most of these scales are rating is how does the ESG expectation and evolving regulatory and market demands on ESG, how do they impact that company? So the arrow is going the wrong way in terms of the rating. It's just rating the wrong thing. It's directionally incorrect. So I want to highlight that for you as a reality that we face in the space, and as an illustration of how much work we need to do here. On the overall landscape, I'll just quickly bullet these. On complexity, we can talk about the absence of consistent definitions, the proliferation of standards that need to align, the range of metrics that you can get from a variety of sources, some of very questionable quality. The question of greenwashing, which we talked about, or what you can also call virtue signaling, and how much of this becomes a kind of a, let's say, marketing and PR exercise versus a substantive ESG and sustainability initiative and commitment. From the perspectives point of view, I want to highlight that it's very common to look at ESG through a risk lens, but we miss a trick when we don't look at the opportunities involved. So if we think about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, all 17 of them, and the whatever it is, 250 odd sub-goals underneath that, that has been characterized as the biggest opportunity roadmap that's ever been put together in one place. And so if we don't look at the opportunity side of the ESG discussion, we're missing a really significant part of the equation. One of the things that we came up with in our practice in London is that there is a critical opportunity to link ESG commitments and aspirations with the core purpose of the organization or the entity that is speaking about these ESG elements. And I'm happy to elaborate if we have time at the end of this. From an execution or implementation perspective, a couple of things again to highlight. You know, even when we talk about net zero, it's not clear to me that we all mean the same things. Some actually mean that they will, on net, reduce their carbon emissions, and therefore they will drive to net zero. Others actually mean, no, actually, we're going to continue business as usual, and what we're going to do is go out into the market and buy carbon credits so we can offset what we're already doing. So there's a real spectrum, again, of quality of commitments and substance of activities around what net zero means. Just transition, I mentioned a minute ago, you know, how just is it to claim that Africa should reduce its use of non-renewable energy when it currently contributes less than 2% of the global greenhouse gas emissions? And China, India, the United States, and Europe are actually the big contributors and have been for the last 200 years in some cases, if not longer. So how just is that transition really when burning coal in parts of Africa and South Asia and other parts of the world can actually be a matter of life and death for families and communities. So I think we need an adult conversation around what that means and how we execute it. Marketing versus substance, we talked about. And then we can tie this to international trade, global supply chains, engaging SMEs in the sustainability and ESG discussion, and then talking about how policymakers and regulators and regulatory authorities can start to become involved, as they are doing already, in a more significant way to chart the path. I'm wrapping up here shortly, very conscious of the time, but I want to highlight for you, I mentioned the context issue, right? But let's look at the emitters just from a climate perspective here. And you can see very clearly how huge the differences are between the largest emitters of greenhouse gases and the smallest. And as I mentioned, sometimes an entire continent emits far less than a single country. And I'll just point to one other thing, which is that the global shipping industry, which many of us involved in trade are keeping an eye on, is actually emitting something like 2 to 3% of greenhouse gases globally. So it sits typically somewhere between Canada and Japan as a pretty significant emitter. Contextually, I just want to point out, here's COVID-19 in the graphic on the right-hand side, and the little call out box that says wash your hands and everything will be fine. And then we talk about the recession that we're now in, probably even worse than recession, then climate change. But then there are those that argue that biodiversity collapse is actually a much larger wave that is both linked to and affecting and affected by climate change. So those two arguably are interlinked, and there's a much more significant problem taking shape that isn't getting nearly enough attention from a priority and policy perspective. So I think, ladies and gentlemen, that's my 15 minutes, and those are the points I wanted to highlight for you today as we set the stage on ESG and set the initial tone for the discussion that follows. So I thank you very, very much for joining, and Andrea and Eric, thank you again for the invitation.
No, that was due, Alexander. I thank you so much for the great insights, by the way. As usual, as you shared with us on January the 11th, I very much treasure what you just said. So it leaves the ground to the next speech by my friend Bob Havestein. Is also a very valuable acquaintance of the meeting that we used to run on a bi-weekly basis within the Hyperledger community. So I wouldn't love to steal too much time to Bob, and I'll leave the stage to him directly to deliver his speech. He's going to reframe under regulatory field. So Bob, stage is yours, please, and we take it from there.
Okay. Hopefully I'm sharing my screen right now. Also in a way that you actually can see something. Or not?
No share screen yet, Bob,
Okay.
but we can see you.
Okay, that is great. My apologies then. I'm trying once more.
Don't apologize. You're a good looking guy.
It's happening again. Well, first of all, welcome everybody while I try to do my utmost effort to find my own presentation back. We're all talking about net zero. So the question is basically, what does it mean? Oh, and I'm now really doing stuff difficult for myself. And how do we actually can measure it? Why is this doing difficult today? A lot.
What's happened, Bob? Have you got difficulties in sharing
I have
screen?
I have difficulties with my screen, but hopefully you see it now.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet?
No.
Because I see it, but what is the difficulty? Oh my God, terrible.
Yeah, let me see if I can pull it up for you, Bob.
Yeah, I changed a few slides, but still. Oh my God. I cannot control anything at the moment.
We can see you anyway, Bob.
Yeah,
maybe
doing difficult.
You want me to pull them up?
If you can pull them up, that would be okay for me.
And are these the one that you would like?
Thank you very much. So net zero, what does it mean and how do you get there? Well, one of the hints is basically it's the supply chain. That is the key to your success. So what does actually net zero mean? If you want to be clear, that's hopefully visible on the next slide. What it is not is basically carbon neutrality. That is something also Alexander mentioned. That's basically that you reduce your carbon emissions by balancing by carbon offsetting. You basically buy carbon credits. And that is not, in my opinion, how you should define net zero. Net zero is basically a simple equation where you balance between the emissions you actually emit from human activity and it's released into the atmosphere and the emission which are in the atmosphere and actually can capture out of the atmosphere back into something else. So it's basically an equation between two things where you reduce your own emissions and you actually remove the additional greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere. The next step would be climate neutrality, where you reduce all your greenhouse gas emissions. So that's carbon emission, as well as methane and nitro oxygens. And also make sure that you eliminate all negative environmental impacts. So if you make a visualization of net zero, on one hand, you have all the emissions you actually emit through human activity. And on the other side, you have all the emissions you basically can retract from the atmosphere. And that should be equal to each other. Unfortunately, at this moment, our technology is not so good that we can extract a lot of greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere. So one way of doing it basically means to reduce the other side of the equation. So we have to reduce the amount of carbon emissions we have. So for that, we actually require a net zero strategy. So how would it look like? That's visible on the next slide. Is basically you have to look at your carbon equivalent emissions. So it's not only carbon emissions, but also methane and the nitro and oxygens. That you have to decrease over time your amount of emissions. And by 2050, you should be zero. Most likely, that will be impossible to completely neutralize all your greenhouse gas emissions. So in that end, it's only allowed to reduce your carbon emissions by removing them with the help of the technologies you just described. So yeah, this is something we require not to be able to exceed the 1.5 degree limit, which was also mentioned by Alexander. And how did we come actually to this limit? Because one of the things is that we see all these events happening around the world, that we have these huge effects of the climate, droughts, huge header, water problems, heat waves, and yes, they're not insurable. That would cost too much money, but at the same time, it's not really a planet which is inhabitable. So we should really decrease it. And also that has been outed by politicians in certain commitments, in certain meetings we had to hold together. So that's visible on the next slide. In 2015, we had the Paris Agreement, where we basically agreed that we want to limit the global warming to 2 degrees, and preferably actually to 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial era, so compared to 1850. Then in 2019, it's visible hopefully on the next slide, we had the European Green Deal, where we decided in 2030, we actually should reduce already 55% of the greenhouse gas emissions we currently emit during 2019. As a continent in Europe, we will also want to be first climate neutral in 2050 as well. Then on top of that, in 2021, we actually had another nice event, the Glasgow statements, which probably you would remember or recognize better as the COP26. And there we also referred really clearly, we should be net zero to be not exceeding the 1.5 degrees. We should also protect our ecosystems and our habitats. We should mobilize finance to be able to actually achieve this. And also we should collaborate, and that's not collaborate in a country-wise. Now the richer countries should really collaborate with the poorer countries to make this feasible, not only with knowledge, with money, but also with the technology. And also, as Alexander said, we're not equally emitting, so the most of the share is actually in the developed world to be able to share, to work on this. And as mentioned also by Alexander, there's so many different statements. What means what is the sustainability? What is ESG? And how do you can measure that? So there are many different standards. They're all different, but they seem to be pointing at least to the same point itself and end up. One of the initiatives which is happening in the European Union is, that's on the next slide, that's the European Sustainable Finance Strategy, which basically creates standards for financial and sustainability reporting, all what it means to promote sustainable investments. So you really have sustainable and fair economic growth, but also manage these environmental risks which are arising for the climate change due to biodiversity loss and human rights, and they really promote this long-term thinking. Well, to be able to support this, you need some framework to support this, which is related to all of the other. And for that, they have created the taxonomy. That's on the next slide. It's basically giving you a tool, an assessment of sustainability. It basically creates you a classification system based on criteria on the economic activities you as a corporate are performing. And with that, you can actually define if you're sustainable, yes or no, because otherwise it becomes one of these just empty words and you can use it for greenwashing. So here are very clear criteria. And basically for the economic activity, it must be contribute substantially and also do not any harm to any of the other objectives if you are actually contributing to one or more of them. And at the same time, it also meets the social safeguards, so more from the social perspective. So the EU taxonomy currently is focusing a lot on the environment with a little bit of social, but there is already a draft which came out last year, which is focusing much more even on the social as well as the governance. So this is a really nice tool to help you as a company. It's not only important that this is possible there, so you can do the assessment, but also for other means. And that's visible hopefully in the next slide, where it states like, okay, it's great that you can do the assessment of your sustainable impact, but in the same time, a lot of companies have to be able to report on this. So they have to be able to comply with the rules and regulations, which is set in the European Union. At the same time, it helps them with the reputation as well as the risk management. Also, the scoring itself will be very important for financial institutions, because if you're a very polluter, so to say, or not really a sustainable company, the chances that you actually start to get access to finance starts decreasing as well. So it's really important for you as a company to be assessing this and to be actually compliant, because that will help you to be future-proof for the rest of your business and the success. So first, the focus is that only large corporates have to really meet these requirements and to be reporting on it. And later on, this will also go to the smaller ones into the SME domain. But my advice is to most of the companies already try to look at this, try to learn from it, and try to see how compliant you are, because it will help you in the long run. So one of the things that the taxonomy is also looking at is greenhouse gas emissions. And greenhouse gas emissions come basically from 3 different types of sources, which you can call one, the direct emissions, which are due to the operations of your company. The second one is the scope 2, also called the indirect emissions, which are the emissions which are related to the energy you buy to operate your business. And the third one is basically related to your value chain. So there's upstream as well as downstream from the focus company. So with that, basically, it starts already impairing that your supply chain is extremely important when you look at net zero and your net zero strategy. Because if you look at your supply chain, that's visible in the next slide, it starts basically with the raw material sourcing, manufacturing, distribution, use, and end use. So it's both as well, upstream as well as downstream. You have to look at it because all of them have a huge impact. And if you look very well about, what was it? It's present on the next slide. About 50% of the global emissions on carbon dioxide are emitted by 8 of the different supply chains related to food, construction, electronics, and also freight. For instance, transport. Alexander mentioned that shipping is about 2 to 3% already of the global greenhouse gas emissions. Transport in general is already 29% of all the global greenhouse gas emissions. So it contributes quite a lot. So we really have to decrease our greenhouse gas emissions. And the first focus of most of the companies is on carbon dioxide, which is one of the easiest to look at. What are the decarbonization opportunities if you look at your supply chain? Well, if you look at your raw material sourcing, it's of course that you select the materials which have a good climate performance. You already use green or recycled materials. And even if you create it, that you look at the form factors of your product, the weight, the size, and if it's reusable and easy to exchange in components. So when you manufacture it, you also start looking already that you're very efficient inside your processes and that you use a lot of renewable energies instead of the current fuel sources which emit a lot of carbon dioxide. Then in distribution and retailing, which is 2 slides further already, we have to think about using electric fleets for the distribution of transportation and also be much more efficient in your processes in energy perspectives. And if you use it, yeah, you should promote also long-time usage. And actually in the end of use, you should also think about reselling it, reusing it. So even using much more and promoting the usage of secondhand. This all depends, of course, on the type of product which you're dealing with. So these are ways to decarbonize your supply chain, but it could also be that actually you think about not being linear, that you also start reusing the material from the beginning. So you have much more of a circular business model. And this might be actually very important, for instance, if you start looking at most of the technology which is required to start using renewable energy. Because if you look at the sources of renewable energy, which are supported by them, we're talking about rare metals and many types of many different rare metals, which are used by mining. So in a way, decarbonization and thinking about moving towards other renewable energy sources is changing the problem a bit. So it's not really an easy equation we have to solve. It's not just looking at your greenhouse gas emissions, because we have to look at the whole sustainable problem in itself. Because if we start producing much more solar panels, windmills, or electric batteries, we need actually much more mining. And with mining, is not one of the industries which is known to be the most clean. We always have the feeling it's quite polluting. And at the same time, it always feels like most of the time there's some kind of land grab involved also. So you also move societies all over, which has a huge impact. So we have to think about it from different perspectives as well. But this is just a sidestep. In general, we would like to have more visibility and transparency in our supply chain, because not only that helps us with our supply chain management, but as an extra result, we have more insight in the measurement of our ESG data and also with our carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. So we have already many tools present for that. We can use IoT devices to measure flows. We have artificial management, artificial intelligence to look at the amount of data we actually have. And blockchain can actually help to automate data collection and to get the insights, to create more transparency, reliability, and traceability. Basically, make your supply chain management much more efficient, improve supply chain sustainability, use it for carbon accounting, use it for enhanced procurement processes. So do we really have suppliers which are ethical, reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, etc. So in the end, it helps us also with net zero reporting. And also it creates all kinds of new opportunities for the smaller players in the market, in your supply chain, the SMEs, where also Alexander referred to. So what is basically very good, and come already closer to the end of my 15 minutes possibility to share my insights with you, I think it's very important to act now. We have to become climate fit, and you have to think about creating a net zero strategy. So for that, you actually require transparency. And with the help of the transparency is try to understand your real data so you can optimize for your emissions. Start first with your carbon dioxide. And with that, basically, you can manage also your suppliers and manage your demand. With that, basically, you're in a position of strength. You're currently already interested in it. You understand the technology. You understand also that you have to move something. So if you have the power of the technology together with think about new operations and new business model, you're in an extreme fantastic position to actually move ahead, make a change in the world, make your world, your own business future-proof, and basically help to make a net zero society possible. Thank you.
Wonderful, Bob. That's great insights. And it gives me a chance to handle the torch to the next speakers. We were talking about data and how they empower supply chain management. We'd love to introduce the next speaker, which is another acquaintance of the Happy Life to Trade Fund and SIG group. And I would love to handle it to Mrs. Rebecca Harding from UK. Rebecca, please step in and stage is yours. We're delighted to have you here sharing your insights and say ESG and trade.
Thank you very much indeed for the opportunity, and it's an absolute delight to be talking to you all. I'm going to share my screen. There will be a flash of data and then I will get to my PowerPoint presentation, so do give me a second, please. I think everything that people have said so far is very relevant and very pertinent. And I have to say, my problem is that I'm an economist, and I say that in the nicest possible way, of course, but I tend to reduce things down to very, very, very simple concepts. And the reason why I do that is because what's already become apparent through all the presentations so far is that this is jolly complicated, and ESG is something that the world has been struggling with for much longer than any of us have been alive. I mean, if I said to you that Silent Spring was written in 1964, that gives you an idea of how long all of this has been going on as a problem, and there were issues before then. So as an economist, what I try to do is boil stuff down into simple things that we can all understand. And I think matching the simple things that we can understand against what we need to do in terms of regulation actually is quite an innovative and a simple way of doing things. And if I said to you, every single company in the world and every single country in the world has one thing in common, which is that they trade in goods or services, then if we can match those products and those services to something that is roughly equating to sustainability, then we get something that looks like an automated score that is, if you like, you can run, but you can't hide. So you're Shell and you're producing oil, full stop. You can run, but you can't hide from that. And it gives a score that is independent and automated. So that was my basic starting point. And what I want to do now is link this into the regulatory challenge. So where we are around the world, and Bob has already made this quite clear, regulation in the past has always been preventative, and the ESG regulation that's coming through now runs that risk as well. So I never forget when I was at Deloitte many moons ago, the head of audit said to me, "We always shut the stable door after the horse has bolted. We are always regulating for the last crisis." So what we're trying to do with regulations at the moment in sustainability is to cut carbon emissions. As Bob said, we have to do something, and this is the only way in which we can start that ball rolling. Now, one of the issues with that is that it runs the risk of being AML KYC-like and actually being punitive, rather than being something that helps companies to adjust. And the important thing that I'm hearing from today and from all the networks and frameworks that I've been in over the last year or so is that everybody wants this to be not just mitigating, but actually to help manage the transition. And in the whole trade and trade finance space, there are a couple of things that we need to avoid. Alexandra has already alluded to this, but it's absolutely the case that there is potential with self-reporting and with diverse data and information that we get greenwash, because we don't really know what we're regulating for at the moment. I mean, you can measure your greenhouse gas emissions, but the vast majority of the world is driven by very small companies at the moment who don't have to regulate, don't have to report on their carbon emissions. And in any case, if we create regulations, again, as Alexander said, and as an economist would also say, if we start measuring something, it very often turns into the wrong target because people find ways around it. We also, as I've said, had the issue of an AML KYC compliance nightmare. So what we need to do is actually use the regulation as a tool to be proactive through credit pricing rather than something that is punitive and actually discourages activity, because we already have a vast number of businesses around the world that can't get access to trade finance. What we need to do is provide a tool that helps them to get through that morass of regulations and so on, and onboarding in a way that's relatively cheap, relatively easily. So what I'm going to do today is present to you a very simple set of ideas around how we start to do this. It's the start of a journey. It's something that we're working on. But my core argument really is that data is a regulatory prerequisite. And the regulators themselves aren't thinking that through. They aren't thinking about how to make data consistent, how to make it standardized. And these are exactly the same conversations that we've had in the whole digital arena, the blockchain arena, everything. How do you create standards that are harmonized across the world and that we all agree on? So my next slide really says what the key regulations and regulatory considerations in data and scoring need to be. Number one, they have to be independent. So a regulator needs an independently verified score. Now, Moody's, S&P, all of those types, Refinitiv, they've all started to do this, to start to build regulatory scores that are independent. But the fact is they're only dealing with the largest companies at the moment. And, you know, the regulations are coming in through the United States, the SEC, through the European Union on supply chains, where increasingly it's going to be smaller businesses as well that have to be reporting. And verifying all of those and on a high frequency basis is going to be very difficult indeed. The other thing is that leads on from that in a way is it needs to be automated, because if we are going to rely on self-reporting all the time, we increase the risks of greenwash, we increase the risks of information being unreliable. It doesn't mean that we don't need self-reporting, but a scoring system can't rely just on self-reporting. And the problem that we have across the whole banking sector, not just trade finance, is that we have to make something that is replicable and that it's scalable. So it has to be scalable. It has to be something that can be scored at a transactions level or a contract level in order to create that incentivization, that credit pricing decision, if you like. So these are all considerations that the regulators actually don't seem to have thought about. They've, as Alexander said, they've created a system, but it's not necessarily a system that's implementable for every single type of business, or one that is scalable in every single transaction. And I will give you a number. We were talking to a very large organization that had 6,000 companies in its supply chain, just 6,000. We were working out that if it went through the onboarding process using self-reporting and the particular, and it's anonymous, I won't say which client or which business, but the organization reckoned that it took a day and a half to fill in the onboarding questionnaires for ESG, the sustainability reporting. And my finance director, who happened to be in this meeting at the same time, said to me, sent me a WhatsApp message and said, that's 26 years, man years, person years of time, just once a year to fill in those forms. It's impossible. That's why we need this to be replicable and scalable. There are all sorts of imponderables in this space. It's a huge area. And so, as Bob said, we need to think about things that are relatively simple to start with. Now, here's the regulatory language, and you can see the type of time frame, and I haven't included the SEC on this because when I first put together this slide deck, the SEC hadn't announced that it was going to make things mandatory, reporting mandatory. But you can see quite clearly the timelines here. we've already got the EU taxonomy. Certain aspects of it are being implemented now. They're becoming compulsory now, and all of this is something, you know, we've had the supply chain regulations, we've had sustainable SFDR, sustainable finance disclosure regulations, and they all have indicators against them that can be used. The UK is slightly behind, but the German and the EU supply chain laws are going to be coming in. But really by 2024-25, but possibly even by the beginning of next year, we need to have structures in place and the data in place in order to be able to meet some of these regulatory requirements. So data cannot be understated how important all of this is. And it's something that the regulators haven't thought through. And actually, I feel sorry for the organisations having to implement all of this under SFDR and the EU taxonomy, because there are lists, but we're building lists. We're not actually giving an idea of what needs to be measured. If you look at the IFRS, it's 560 pages of lists of things that you need to measure. It's just very, very difficult to implement. So what we've done as a business, and I will say this is the start of a journey, is we've taken all of this as a consideration and started to look at an automated way of approaching all of this. And as I said, I'm an economist, so I've boiled it down to basics. I'm talking about supply and demand. I'm talking about what companies buy and what companies sell. We needed to have a consideration. We needed to do something that was equally applicable and non-biased. So Alexander has said, Bob has said that there are real big concerns around something being differential across countries, and certainly emerging market economies feel like they are always subject to some form of bias, simply because they come from confirmation bias, almost because they come from a certain region in the world. And so we needed something that is applicable everywhere. And again, boiling it down to something very simple like supply and demand of a product or a service helps you do that. Also needed to make sure that the reach is global. So it's every single company that is on company registries, that ties in with the LEI digital data systems as well, so that we can start to develop what one of the banks is calling a passport, a preliminary passport, almost like an experience score. But the other consideration is trade is not just goods anymore. We have to think about services trade as well. That makes it very difficult because it's less easy to document what service companies are doing. A lot of that goes through transactions. We also have to include SMEs in all of this, because that's how we capture the tier 1 to the tier 5 supply chain. And then it has to be real time and flexible. It has to be able to go down to a transactions level. So we've started to do this, and I'm just going to move that so that you can see what we're doing. We've started to do it against, and Bob, you'll recognise this. This is the Sustainable Finance Disclosures Regulation, the SFDR, and Principal Adverse Impact Scoring. This is something that actually comes from the SFDR. These are the types of things that are being looked at. And so what we've started to do is we take product codes and we match them to sustainable development goals. We take service sector trade codes, so we take industry codes, but we also take the international trade codes that are there for measuring international trade in services. And again, we match them to sustainable development goals. We take industry codes, so that's ISIC codes or NACE codes, and we map those to the EU taxonomy. And we do that because actually the measurement within the EU taxonomy is all at the NACE code level. So it's all about the data of the company itself, its activities in the sector that it's in. And then what we do is we take all of that information and we use AI to match to the reporting requirements. So we can give a score for the EU taxonomy, how many areas are doing some or no significant harm, how many are contributing positively. We can do a list of sustainable development goals and how the products match. And then this is the most important thing in terms of the SFDR. We're actually building in information that matches against the SFDR. So, for example, greenhouse gas emissions, the next thing we do after all of this is we take European Space Agency satellite data and we match it to the postcode of the company so that we can see its carbon and greenhouse gas emission exposure in the immediate vicinity around the company. So that starts to give us a scope 1 type carbon emission picture, or at least risk exposure, because a lot of this is being conceptualized as sustainability risk by banks. So this is just a starting point. We have done all of this work. We've got some work with geographical information systems and doing some spatial finance work as well. But this is the starting point of the process. Now, if I go down the slide, you can start to see why this is interesting. So I'll move away from the sales pitch and into something that actually gives us a bit more insight into what's happening around the world. Because obviously, if you look at trade all the way around the world, you've got a lot that contributes negatively or positively to sustainable development goals. So we have taken trade data from everywhere around the world at 6-digit level. So that's going right the way down to a very detailed level for HS codes. So this is goods only, it's not services at the moment. And you can see where the biggest negative contributions to sustainable development goals are from international trade: zero hunger, responsible consumption, affordable and clean energy, sustainable cities, clean water, and then just a general bucket of other. Over the last 5 years, those are the areas that have had most negative contributions from trade through this HS code to SDG mapping. And by the way, that's not our mapping. We've augmented it and developed it, but just so that we don't look as though we're doing something totally crazy, we've actually used the United Nations mapping from SCAP, mapping the HS codes and sustainable development goals to our big data set. And what we conclude from all of this, I think this is the most interesting chart here. This is taken directly from our dashboard, so we can do it. We can look at any country, we can look at any year, and we've broken it down using the ICC's framework that was developed at the Boston Consulting Group. We've looked at the Sustainable Development Goals roughly, and then we've mapped each of those over to E, S, and G. What does this tell us? It tells us straight away that we're governing, we're regulating, we have enough going on that's actually good and contributing to SDGs like strong and stable institutions. In other words, our trade is being governed very, very well. But if you look at what's happening on the environmental side, it's negative 0.73. In other words, of all trade, it's tipped massively in the direction of negative contributions. If we get, this is almost like a doomsday clock. If we get to -1, then actually we're blowing the planet up. Here you can see the same thing on social goals as well. And this is why emerging market economies get really upset about the way in which we're measuring a lot of these things. If you look at what trade does actually to the social side of things, it's minus 0.91. So much is biased towards, we are almost blowing the planet up socially. Inequality, lack of food, all of these types of things that are affecting economies around the world. So, but the interesting thing about all of this is if you look at the G20 sustainability scores for each of the countries, and then look at some of the poorest countries in the world, the poorest countries in the world actually fare better than the richest countries in the world. Why? Because the richest countries in the world are consuming more in terms of consumer goods, and they're consuming more in terms of plastics and throwaway things, single-use plastics. So actually, it's the developed world that's thinking about sustainability criteria and imposing regulations in order to deal with something. And I have to say, we must do something about this. Time is of the essence. But you can see quite clearly here that some of the big culprits are actually regions like the EU. So intra-regional trade, extra-regional trade is scoring almost minus 0.7. So European trade within Europe, because of the types of things, oil, automotives, electronics, all of these types of equipment things, that's actually contributing very negatively to global trade. So development next steps, where do we go from here? We have our 1.0 product in the market. We have also integrated some self-reporting into the platform. So we've linked it into the type of questionnaires that banks have, like Sustainalytics and EcoVadis, but we have our own very quick self-reporting that uses natural language processing to process documents. And then we also have the GIS elements that are coming in as well. We have our working group for ESG. We're working with 65 banks around the world on developing the next step, which is actually to develop that greenhouse gas and carbon emission scores, scope 1 to 3, using bill of lading data, which we're integrating right now. And over time, our goal is to use GIS, spatial finance, to augment the automated scoring that we're already seeing, and then also to create a self-reporting element, because as Bob and as Alexander have already said, a lot of this is down to the company, and you have to have that self-reporting element as well. So I think I've used up my time. Thank you very much indeed, and back to you.
Thank you, Rebecca. It was really great one, great presentation, great insights. Love to now, we have been focused a lot on regulation, on taxonomy. Now we go straight to the industry, maybe having a look at this under an academic point of view. So we cross the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, and we go to Wyoming. Actually, that's where my friend Sohail Saraji works, at the University of Wyoming. So we're going to have a speech on carbon tracking, carbon offsetting. Sohail, the stage is yours, please. We'll look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you very much for the introduction. Let me try to share my screen, and hopefully you guys can see my screen. We can start. Okay, good. Well, thank you everybody for attending today's talk. My name is Sohail Saraji. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Petroleum Engineering here at the University of Wyoming. My talk would have a little bit different flavor from what you have heard so far today. I come from different backgrounds, and I'll look at the whole picture from a different perspective. So here's the title of my talk today: blockchain energy and the carbon credit markets specifically is something that I'm going to a little bit more focus on. This would be the outline of the talk today. I try to set the stage. I know that some of these you already know, but I'll a little bit talk about global carbon emissions from the energy perspective. I'll talk a little bit about the blockchain itself. If somebody in the audience doesn't know what it is, or I'll give it more of a historic background rather than a technical background. Then I'll talk about the beautiful state of Wyoming that you might not have heard of before. And I'll talk to you about the projects, or rather a group of projects that we're working on in this regard. And I then talk about the pilot projects on carbon credit markets. First, on the global carbon emissions, you can see from this popular graph that these are the carbon emissions, both carbon dioxide, CO2, and others, coming from different sectors. And the energy industry is obviously one of the biggest contributor to the carbon emissions. The dark blue and dark green in the graph shows the emission from the energy sector. This includes both burning of the fuels and also production, the entire supply chain of the fuels. Obviously, we have a lot of us, or a lot of governments are committed to Paris Agreement of keeping 1.5 degrees centigrade temperature rise compared to the pre-industrial age. And if we want to keep that promise, we need to take care of energy sector emission, right? So one of the part of this is transition from fossil fuels. Obviously, we need to look into renewable energy. One of the technologies that can play a role in a transition stage, at least, it would be carbon capture, storage, and utilization. We need to look into decentralized power systems and see how that can help us to create more resilient network, and also bring renewables in a more sustainable fashion to the power networks. And also we need to get to the goal of net zero carbon energy production by 2050, as put out by IRENA report recently, and a lot of different NGOs are also committed to that. So with that in mind, I'll talk a little bit about blockchain itself, because that's one of the topics of this conference. And I don't go through much detail, and I have just one slide. So what blockchain is, first of all, it was just a network to support cryptocurrency. That was the purpose of blockchain. And it started with an interesting movement. If you're interested, you can learn more about it by searching on YouTube. A Cyberpunk Movement started in 1990s, and this was a group of cryptographers that were against centralized control. And then the whole movement solidified in a Bitcoin white paper in 2008 and a Bitcoin launch of the Bitcoin network. A few years after experimentation with the network from a lot of different interested parties, a new concept came out. With the new concept, the idea was that the blockchain itself is such a valuable technology that we could decouple it from cryptocurrency and use it for other applications. And the concept of world computer came into play with the release of the Ethereum white paper, which is another blockchain network. And then there was explosion of smart contract platforms, different DAOs, and a lot of other ideas that came out of that. Shortly after, we realized that the idea of world computer might not be the direction to go because of all limitation that blockchain has in terms of computational capacity and computational resiliency. So rather than resiliency is a computational transaction per second or transaction per hour. So the next paradigm that is currently the dominant paradigm among the blockchain community is that blockchain could become a future of internet. And the concept you might have heard, Web 3.0, came out with particularly with the Polkadot white paper, but others also supported that. We almost in the process of solving the problem of interoperability, which is a big hurdle. Before we solved the problem, everybody thought that one blockchain would win it all and would take all the use cases. Now with solving the interoperability, now we can have a specialized blockchain that can do one thing very good, and then they can communicate with each other. So that's a little bit background. A little bit about the state of Wyoming. I want to make two arguments. The first argument is that Wyoming is an energy state in the United States here. We are the third largest producer of energy in the US. Our traditional basket of energy has been oil, gas, and coal. But we also have a lot of potentials and a lot of investment currently on developing renewable energy, including wind, solar, geothermal, and very recently a lot of push on hydrogen production. Wyoming is trying to be a hub in the United States for hydrogen production. With that, and we also have been having several decades of experience in carbon capture, utilization, and storage in the state. The argument I want to make is that the government of Wyoming recently announced net zero or net negative, rather, carbon energy mix plan for the future of Wyoming. So we, as a state, we are well suited in the playing a big role in the energy transition in the United States and globally. Also, I want to argue that the Wyoming is maybe a less known fact, is a blockchain state. We are one of the earliest states in the United States to adapt laws and regulations around blockchain. This shows a relative timeline of what has happened so far. We started with some taxonomy laws and figuring out what is the difference between utility tokens versus other type of tokens. And then recently, state of Wyoming has announced that DAOs will be considered if they fall within a certain category, they will be considered as legal companies or LLCs in the state of Wyoming, at least. So these are all a lot of interesting laws and regulation that allows for blockchain community to thrive in the state of Wyoming. All right, so with that in mind, me and my colleagues at the University of Wyoming are developing a new set of projects under the umbrella. Before now, we call it energy blockchain. We want to look into intersection of energy and blockchain, and we want to see what applications we can develop, how can we help the state, and how can we help globally for the energy transition wave to happen. Obviously, we are an educational institution, so we have educational arm. We are working on different courses. One of the new courses that we just developed is called, the same title as this talk, is called Blockchain in Energy. which I'm teaching in the coming fall 2022. As far as I know, it is a very unique course. Nobody else is teaching it in any other institutions. We have a really good student body, a really good reaction from student body so far. And we are even thinking, since we are getting a lot of requests from outside the States, maybe we can create an online course to teach it online for people that are interested in this topic. We are currently writing a book and several book chapters on different publications coming up. But also we are very focused on the research and development side. We have been working on several applications. We have filed for several patents, and more patents are coming. We are looking into creating a commercial entity to bring these ideas to the market. So hopefully with that, you have a little bit of background what's happening here at Wyoming. Now I want to talk a little bit about carbon credit markets and what blockchain can do in this regard. So carbon credit markets is something very general. It could be applied to supply chain. It could be applied to different industries. My background is in the energy industry, and that's the perspective I brought with the carbon credit markets. I know it is a very controversial issue. Politically, it's a lot of people are pro it, and a lot of people are against it for different reasons from two different spectrum. Some people think it's might be negative impact on climate if this become a big deal, or some people think it would be against free markets or the government trying to regulate. But this disregard to all of this argument, we just published a white paper about a couple of years ago to put up a design of what this could look like from an ecosystem point of view, not from just a token or just something that can create value for a short period of time, but rather as a sustainable ecosystem. So with that background, I want to give a little bit of a background on why carbon credit markets are important. With the Kyoto Protocol, we had a little bit of a mind shift about carbon emissions. We thought about carbon emissions as a problem, still is a problem, but it shifts our perspective for carbon to become a commodity to be traded, right? And there is a big hype about it. At least there used to be a hype, and then it's coming back. New York Times said that it is on its way to become the world's largest commodity market. As a matter of fact, in 2019, carbon trading peaked at $215 billion globally. Now, there are certain problems with carbon credit markets as it is currently. They are fragmented implementation of that. Different jurisdictions have their own scheme with different limits and different regulations around it. European Union has its own scheme. Here in the United States, California as a state have its own cap and trade system. There's a New Zealand scheme that is currently developed, and others in Asia. However, and that creates a problem. There's not much cross-market exchange of value, and that can be a problem because we are trying to solve a global problem. Carbon emissions, doesn't matter where it is happening, it affects everybody on a global scale. But when you implement it fragmentally, then we are not solving the problem the way it's supposed to be solved. And certain jurisdictions have been criticized for over-crediting carbon credits, which defeats the purpose. There are certain carbon credits have unclear life cycle. We don't know what happens to them. Somebody buys them and it exchanged hand to hand, and we don't know what happened to them. There's a problem of double spending that's been highlighted on several publications. And there's other problems, the substantial transaction costs, which requires the brokers or agents to be the intermediaries to, and that transfer of wealth. I read somewhere between 5 to 10% is the commission for helping a company to trade carbon credits in different jurisdictions. So these are all the things that the blockchain can solve. Specifically, more precisely, blockchain can provide a safe and reliable platform for issuance of carbon credits or carbon offsets, tracking of them, and burning of them if somebody wants to use them against their carbon emission. And this could be tracked, could be auditable, especially if you use a public blockchain. It is efficient and convenient. A lot of smaller companies have not been participating in carbon offsets because it is cumbersome. It's they need to have a few employees to just follow up on their carbon offsets, and that become a hassle. However, blockchain is by nature, it's accessible to anybody that wants to participate. Of course, there is a little bit of a barrier in terms of somebody needs to learn a little bit about blockchain, but now there are new solutions coming up that hide the blockchain as a backbone of the what's happening, and you use basically a website to interact with the blockchain directly. So this allows to create minimal intermediary involvement, and that also solves the brokers and agents problem. It's also open and inclusive. Everybody can participate. It's accessible, as I mentioned, to the small and medium-sized enterprises. Here's a brief overview of the design that we put out there. The idea was that to create a discussion and create a little bit of a, at least we need to start from somewhere, just put the mark and see, okay, this is what we think should be done, and then we'll see what other people want to do with it. So the idea here was to create an ecosystem, and in this ecosystem, we are looking into carbon credits. There would be credit holders, which would be people that are either capturing and storing CO2 or creating renewable energy to replace the fossil-based energy. There would be consumers of that. These consumers could be individuals, could be in my point of view personally, if we want this system to work, we need to engage the energy industry. In my opinion, the customers should be energy industry because they have the money and they now have to moving towards ESG compliance, and they should be basically funding all this development of renewable energy. And this scheme allows for this to happen. For us to make sure there is everything is under control, and this minting and burning of carbon credits are actually monitored, we need to have a certified validators or a system of certified validators. And with the multi-sig verification scheme, we guarantee that at least certain number, we can decide what is the threshold, 70%, 80% of this validator agree that certain project deserve this number of carbon tokens based on on-site monitoring and reporting of the carbon emissions or renewable energy generation. And they would be benefited by the network, not necessarily from the projects themselves, because that creates a misalignment of interest. It rather networks pays the certified verifiers to do their job, and they then with that it would create a smart contract that generates certain tokens for certain project. We also thought about the liquidity that the system requires, and that could be solved by something that the cryptocurrency already solved, and that's AMM, or automated market maker system, which are the system that allows trading of the different type of tokens together. Here, we can allow trading of the stable coins with the certain type of carbon tokens to allow people to benefit minimally a fraction of the person from each transaction by providing liquidity to the system so that system can run, right? If you are interested, there is a white paper on that gets to the more detail of this design. At the end, I think I'm coming towards the end of my time. I want to emphasize that there is a huge opportunity at the intersection of blockchain technology, global warming, and energy industry. I think this is something that we're really excited about, and that's what our project is working on. We think that it allows us to modernize the industry. It allows us to create more efficient and more clean energy. And we think we can allow, this allows us also to create sustainable energy accessible to a wider group of people around the world. With that, these are my contact information. I would like to hear from you if you're interested in any of the topics I discussed today. We are also looking for students that are interested to work on this area. We have certain projects that are coming in. If you are interested in any of that, please let me know. These are my contact information. I will be more than happy to get to chat to you about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sahai. That was a great, insightful presentation and a very deep look into the energy industry from a UNSC, from a general perspective, actually, not being based solely on the US market, but globally, which we do need, by the way. So after this perspective on the energy industry, it comes natural to handle this to another important industry, which we mentioned earlier during the presentation, which is the mining industry. So we'd love to kickstart a sort of small roundtable within this meeting between Colin from British Columbia government and also with Heike from Miner Hub. I think maybe Colin can start this out and handle it. It's going to be 20 minutes joint call between the two of you. You take the lead, Colin, and then you'll handle the torch to Heike.
Excellent. Is everyone able to see the screen there?
Yeah, indeed.
Beautiful. And everyone can hear me okay? Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. Today, we're going to be talking about a project occurring in BC, applying Hyperledger and blockchain technology to kind of create verifiable credentials that will be used to kind of trace mining operations, attested sustainability over a few areas. So the project started or was incentivized by a mining disaster that happened probably about 7 years ago at this point, where the tailing ponds of a mine failed because of oversight on, one of the areas along this kind of supply chain oversight traceability standard that should be upheld. And so it's sort of a meshing of the need for validation as to where materials come from on a supply chain and the greater kind of demand for transparency that comes from the growing global consciousness that sustainability is an important part of everyone's life. BC is a hub for mining, and as talked about previously, mining can be quite a detrimental and intense industry if done poorly, or if attention is not paid to sustainable sourcing. And the long-term demand for BC metals is only going to increase as we move into this kind of electrification era, where the demand for, mostly in BC, kind of gold, copper is going to increase. So the question is, how do we control that carbon intensity? Carbon intensity right now is one of the most important kind of factors. And BC is already kind of establishing itself as a world leader in low carbon emission mining. Of course, there's a lot of areas to improve, and this project is one of them. Our annual emissions reporting for industrial facilities are already publicly available, but this project really seeks to kind of expand that transparency and expand that visibility through the supply chain. So the project plan for the Mine Digital Trust is already well underway. We had a proof of concept developed and a lot of early adopters, including one of the mines right here in BC, Copper Mountain Mine, which we'll talk about in a bit. And we're moving now into the pilot and scaling strategy. We are moving very quickly into developing machine readable and human readable governance documents that will kind of develop that system of issuing credentials, looping in a mine, verifying kind of along that supply chain how materials are sourced. So the project has been supported by a lot of partners, and we wouldn't be able to really accomplish this without their help, ranging from University of Oxford, the Mining Association of Canada, Open Earth, which is one of our key partners, Hyperledger Foundation, and all of these individuals have come together, individual organizations, corporations, technology professionals come together because I think there's a globally understood, I guess, priority that there's something that can be improved here. And two really essential partners that we've been working with, that we're developing the pilot project with, is an organization called Open Earth, run by Dr. Martin Weinstein at the Yale Open Lab, whose mission is to kind of harness digital technologies to increase planetary resilience when it comes to monitoring and collection of information. And we're also working with Trust over IP, which is a standard setting kind of technology organization that looks to scale digital internet trust. And this is sort of an idea of the stack of the trust over IP model. And this is really where we're working to build from layer 1 to layer 4 a solution that will allow sustainable sourcing and verifiable credentials throughout that entire supply chain process. So you see at the layer 1 solution, you have different utilities that are then built. We've been building wallets, which will then be used to issue, hold, and verify credentials. And we're developing a few credentials, one based on carbon intensity, one based on scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions. And layer 4 is kind of how that technology is applied in the day-to-day. So something like the health pass, you look at it, we've recently had vaccine passports throughout the world. And this is kind of the technology behind how you are able to trustfully exchange that information between users. And so in terms of more specifics of what we're working with, you can see kind of like hyperledger areas is going to be used for layer 2. For the layer 3 data exchange protocol, we're building one for scope 1 emissions, for scope 2 emissions, and carbon intensity. And these are all. And the interesting thing about the trust over IP system is that it's a real split between the machine readable technology side being transferred over to the governance stack and the human readable side. So there will be human readable documentation to go along with the machine readable documentation to really allow that kind of interoperability and kind of the public facing, allowing the technology to be understood by policymakers. And so this is really the kind of unique system that trust over IP offers. And so this is, again, kind of a specific example of our model. And this is the pilot project we're working on. Now, this is the carbon accounting pilot. We are doing one again for carbon we're looking at one towards sustainable mining. We got a couple of ideas coming down the pipeline, but right now we're looking to kind of develop what's articulated here. So we already have a mine that's involved, and they would hold a data wallet that would hold credential to be verified by Open Climate. And these would be looked up and stored on the Candy ledger, where the verifiable data registry would be held. And again, this is where the blockchain public ledger comes in. And it would be, right now, we've had a slight pivot in terms of who would be issuing this. PwC, which is a standard setting company, might fill in for CAS, but the Climate Action Secretariat would issue credential to a mine that would outline certain standards of carbon intensity. And the circle kind of continues. The information would flow from the mine to be verified, to be recorded on the ledger. And this would, in kind of real time, allow data on sustainability and sourcing to occur. And so, yeah, in many ways, we're still very much in the beginning part of the project. But I guess bringing it back to what this kind of group is all about, we're kind of in the forefront of developing several lessons. Really, BC is one of the first to be utilizing the trust over IP stack in this way. So we're very much in real time learning the lessons day by day as to how to do this better and to how to build a use case, applying Hyperledger and blockchain technology to the supply chain as it relates to mining, as it relates to sustainable sourcing. And we're hoping that, a few lessons can be taken from this, that supply chain will be allowed to kind of confirm the attested sustainable sourcing of materials. We know that technology can confirm these verifiable origins for physical, digital goods, and kind of give consumers that confidence about the proven kind of journey of that supply chain. I didn't mention it here because there's still some kinks to iron out, but we are in the process of developing a partnership with Mitsubishi, who is one of the largest, or if not the sole receiver of Copper Mountain's copper and metals, and they will be kind of the end section of that supply chain, where ideally what we're working towards is, you go buy a Mitsubishi car, you as a consumer can look through this entire supply chain, how the credentials were managed, where do they come from. When you buy a car from Mitsubishi, you will be able to say, well, I am aware and I'm confident that this level of standard was adhered to. So again, still very much in the works, but that is kind of the main goal we're working toward. And then I guess the third lesson that we're working with is that blockchain within supply chain can offer that kind of lifetime private digital connection with customers, suppliers, partners, creating that, as it's famous for, an immutable ledger that is able to be kind of confirmed by customers and people all over the world. So I'm very excited to see where this project goes. It really is an exciting thing to be a part of. And thank you very much again for inviting me to be part of the panel.
Thanks, Callum. So this gives you the chance to handle torch now to Heike and be back to a European perspective. Heike, glad to have you here today with us. Glad to make acquaintance with the MineHub world. So you take the lead from here and share your insights with us.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And it's a privilege to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Let me see if my screen sharing works. Can you see that? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we do. Perfectly.
Okay, fantastic. I'm glad that worked. So my name is Heike Troll, and I'm the Chief Commercial Officer for MineHub Technologies. So it was fascinating to listening to all of the other panelists before me, and also to listen to Callum what's being done in BC on the mining side. So the MineHub platform is an integrated enterprise blockchain platform that connects parties to commodity transaction. So producers, consumers, financiers, and traders through digital platforms where buyers and sellers can upload, exchange, view documents, and by doing that, basically have one single source of the truth. So everyone is at the same time, all the time. And the focus is very much post-trade. So once the transaction between buyer and seller is already agreed. Now, the underlying blockchain technology ensures the integrity of the information, and we heard that from the previous speakers as well. The security, the integrity, and changes are being made to individual information parts, like, let's say, a certificate of analysis or an ESG credential, and they're being made transparent to all of the parties who have the same access at any point in time. So our users enjoy more efficiency, security, automation, transparency in their post-trade operations, makes their supply chains more resilient, and also automates compliance, such as ESG disclosure or verification. And in this way, frees up capacity in operations for higher value-adding work. So the MineHub platform was developed for the mining industry, but also with the industry. And so we are working with small and large players alike, and quite a few of them have been in the public domain, such as we are working with BHP Billiton and other mining companies. So this is an image I like sharing, which is the left-hand side. I like to call this the before and after slide. So $1.8 trillion in metals and minerals move across the planet. And there's an estimation that 5 to 10% is lost on multi-party and paper-based processes. So one container from Netherlands to Africa, there's 30 organizations involved, 100 people, 200 interactions, takes 34 days. So you can imagine the number of emails, telephone calls that's been floated around the world through different channels. And what the MineHub platform does is free up that data that's locked in courier bags or email attachments, and actually makes it available. So turn communications into data. And then on the ESG side, and we've heard that from Callum as well, responsible sourcing of minerals is increasingly important to end users. And the lack of transparency is a really big regulatory risk and a risk factor for all of the companies involved. So MineHub connects the whole industry ecosystem through a shared version of the truth. And shared doesn't necessarily mean that everybody sees everything, but if 2 or more users look at the same information, it's the same, not different versions. And you and your customer and the bank look at the same BL number, same warehouse receipt, or same ESG credentials. Now we know we can't do everything ourselves as MineHub, so we operate in a large ecosystem. We pull services and data from strategic partners, and we join the dots all the times. So partnering integration is a fundamental part of our strategy to accelerate value for our customers. And particularly on the ESG space, we partner as well to ensure that our customers can pull through ESG credentials that come from the mine side all the way through to the supply chains, and we enable attaching of credentials. So let me just open up the box in the middle here, which is the MineHub platform. So the MineHub platform consists of a core platform and has got applications built on top of that. So at the core is what we call the utility layer, where data can be structured, uploaded, and shared in a fully secured way. And this core experience contains contracts, shipments, logistics, document sharing, ESG data, and so on. And they sit within an IT architecture that is API-based and blockchain-based. And then bolted onto the utility layer are value-added applications, so that further enable the digital transformation. So asset exchange, trade management, and then the ability to report on carbon emissions against the brand. And on the ESG side, that can be either manually entered if a mine has got their carbon footprint, or we also enable a linking through of credentials such as the Coriolis score, or what Callum was talking about as well. And then perhaps just a word on the broader ESG side, because traceability and ESG tracking really go hand in hand. So companies operating across the mining and metal supply chain have a huge exposure to the compliance, brand, and regulatory risks of not being able to showcase or evidence their material provenance and emissions. And as this responsible source of minerals is becoming more and more important to end users, such as how Callum said, if I buy a certain car, I want to know where the copper is coming from, I want to know where the aluminium or the steel is coming from. It's becoming more important, and the lack of transparency across the supply chain leads to risks. And then this is a very hard problem to solve, though. It's hard, it's expensive, and there is a need, and companies alone can't solve that. So this is really where the industry and also the regulation needs to step up. But in the first instance, a shared data system is required across the supply chain participants. That's one of the key parts of the solution. And this is where metals and mining really must now give focus, come together as an industry, also particularly with respect to Scope 3 accounting. And coming together as an industry is never easy and never particularly fast. So technology can play a role in that, and then technology can address that is ready in a way that it actually wasn't before. And before being able to reduce emissions, the industry needs to be able to measure them. And that really is, in that context, the MineHub product vision is to enable the visibility and the automation of ESG reporting across the E, the S, and the G, provide attestation and verification at every step of the supply chain, and making it immediately accessible by everyone and trusted because it's blockchain based, almost like having a product or a bit of a brand passport. And that's it from me. And thank you very much. And any questions, very much welcome.
Thank you, Heike. This was a great completion to Callum's speech. Continuation, very much appreciated to have a deep look into what's going on in mining industry on both sides of the ocean. Coming to the mining industry, that's a big topic also in the country that we're going to talk about, and in the continent that comes next. So it's with great pleasure to introduce Kevin James of GCX, CEO of GCX. and leave it on to him. I leave the stage to him to let us have an outlook on the situation in terms of ESG in Africa and to what his company is doing nowadays in these terms. Kevin, stage is yours, please. Take the lead on the speech.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Andrea, and yeah, thanks for the invitation to be speaking amongst such an esteemed bunch of speakers. I'm going to share my screen now. Let me just do that. And that. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Perfectly, yes. Looks perfect.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. And thanks, everyone, for still being around. It's been quite a long evening. In South Africa, it certainly is evening. I am sitting down in the southern tip of Africa in Cape Town, beautiful Cape Town. And yeah, we got a slightly different lens into this whole story, but very, very exciting. So let me just kick off with a presentation. Okay, so this is a slide that's probably been my best slide for the last 10 years, and it gives us an indication of where we really are as a species in terms of innovation, in terms of our sophistication, not necessarily in terms of evolution, but we certainly have become smarter at doing things and more efficient at doing things. And since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, 1785, we have been making quite a mess. We have been exploiting people. We have been creating a lot of environmental degradation. So all those little humps that you see on the way to the big green one on the right have been fantastic in terms of allowing us to do more things, manufacture more things, and ultimately consume more things and create more waste and other problems. So it's been quite interesting. It's quite interesting to see the internal combustion engine 1900 to 1950, yet we're still driving around with internal combustion engines. So that was a good observation. But the exciting part of this discussion is actually that we're in the sixth wave. The sixth wave is the wave that is coming around out of necessity, but to clean everything up. Okay, it is, they call it the fifth industrial revolution, actually, after the fourth one, which actually takes all the good things that we can do with the world, combine it with all the smart things that we can do as a species, and we can start solving some of the problems that we've created since 1785. This particular wave is characterized by things like renewable energy, green chemistry, biomimicry, systems thinking, energy efficiency, all these kind of things that are really there. Reforestation, biodiversity improvement, etc., etc. So this is a very exciting time, but it's also a time that we have to realize that it lacks maturity. And I suppose the real benefit for Africa, to Andrea's point, is that Africa has always lagged the rest of the world with technology and innovation. But by the time we do get the opportunity to do things in Africa, we can really capitalize on the most recent innovations that there's possibly available and not have to go and retrofit and deal with legacy older technology. So for Africa, this particular discussion is very exciting. So this is a very, very, probably the most used slide in the carbon climate world, which is from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. We joke in our company. So in our company, what we do is we work with some of the biggest companies in South Africa. They're multinational companies, all listed on the stock exchange. And we help them manage and sort their data out and turn it into something that can help them performance manage and benchmark their entire organizations across the world so that they can drive performance and reduce their carbon footprint and enhance their ESG performance. So I want to talk about this in the context actually of, we've had people describe what scope 1, 2, and 3 is from earlier. So we're not going to go through that again. But what we can see is that I'm going to talk about this in the context of a client of ours, which is a dairy farm. All right. So in terms of scope 1, 2, and 3, just the thing that you need to know is depending on your accounting method, you either want to be in control of everything, or if you are in control of everything, then you need to take responsibility, or you make decisions as a company to outsource certain things, which becomes scope 3, which it becomes your supply chain upstream and downstream. For an operation, a dairy farm, for example, your scope 1 would be your boilers for your making steam, your diesel generators, your refrigeration gases, manure management, if that's done on site and you have actually cows and and livestock on site, mobile fuels, things like that, even the flatulation and the enteric fermentation of cows, which is very scientific word for passing wind and burping at the cows, and they're causing this methane. That's one of the big problems in the world today is livestock. So, and then scope 2, the electricity, and then scope 3, which is everything that's done and you've chosen to outsource, even your general waste management, your animal feed, if you're buying that in, your business travel, employee commute, etc. So the typical operation is from your supplier to you and from you to your customer, and everything in between is your responsibility that's done on site. So let's go a bit deeper. A couple of years ago, Faircape asked us to come in and actually expand the scope of their carbon footprint. They said, we want to actually see the entire life cycle, and we want to see it per liter of milk or per 1.5 liters of milk. So we had to go through a whole different exercise. And I mean, this was first done in 2011 when we worked with them. They were one of our first clients, and they really wanted to create some more transparency in their business because they saw it as an opportunity to differentiate themselves. So this is a Faircape typical dairy. You've got your, the stuff in the red would typically be outsourced by a lot of companies, but for our thank goodness, because this is not an easy exercise, especially back in 2011. Faircape actually owned the entire value chain, except for 2 things. They didn't they didn't have the glue for the adhesives on their packaging, but other than that, and I think we didn't take into consideration the actual post-consumer stuff, so people using the product and then disposing of it. So basically, they owned the whole thing, and this is very interesting because the reason why they want to do this, why this is such an important subject, is because it's ultimately the retailers that are responsible for the entire brand, because their reputation is the last, I suppose, mile towards the consumer, and they're judged by their association with other companies in that supply chain, but they don't always have the visibility. And it's not always the usual suspects, the big companies. It might be the small companies that are causing human exploitation or environmental degradation. So this is the reason we do all this thing. It was a very insightful exercise. At the end of the day, we were able to do it, but I just want to make mention that the data side of this is particularly challenging because you want to use primary data, you want to use their data, but it's not always available. Even the 2 things that we didn't have from there, we actually couldn't even get in the end, and we had to use secondary data. The outcome and why this is so important is because a usual dairy would actually some of them don't even have cows. They just bring in the raw material and they will process that at their facility. So sometimes if it's just a dairy, they're actually accounting or reporting on 40% of their carbon emissions. In this case, you can see that most of the carbon emissions are from the actual livestock emissions as well as the production of animal feeds, which Faircape was in control over, but for a lot of companies, they're not. This is why we need to understand the true impact of the carbon emissions of a liter of milk is actually you need to do this. But this is a very hard thing to do. Tesco's tried to do it in the UK many years ago and failed dismally because they tried to do every product and it just got prohibitively expensive. So we need a better way is really the point that I want to prove to you today. So the other thing is about that is, I mean, if you take a company like Nestle, I mean, 5% of Nestle's carbon emissions, the entire value chain is actually their direct emissions. The emissions generated by suppliers actually 10 times higher. So we're talking about something, what is the real picture here? When are we going to be able to have a wider view of what's actually going on? Because consumers, retailers are actually demanding it and a whole lot of other stakeholders as well. So we're talking about net zero. Yeah, let's talk about net zero. It's estimated by the IPCC, which is the main show in town in terms of climate change in the United Nations, that it's going to cost us between $50 and $100 trillion in capital investment to successfully transition to a net zero global economy. That's a lot of money, but it's even a bigger differential between $50 and $100 trillion. I mean, you know, what's $1 trillion between friends, I suppose, but it's a lot of money. Okay. And the stakes are very, very high and everyone's climbing in. There's a lot of opportunity. We're seeing investors now actually that are demanding this kind of thing from their investee companies. The financiers are throwing in sustainable finance and they are driving it down and they see this opportunity to be able to capitalize on this whole thing. It's not a PR opportunity anymore to be able to get sustainable finance. It's actually, we're en route to becoming, if you don't get it, like everything else, it's going to become licensed to operate and you will not be able to participate unless you play the same game. So like I said, the stakes are high, the data needs to be accurate and it needs to be all verified, et cetera, et cetera. So this is quite an interesting one because this is our daily grind at GCX. We deal with companies who claim to have the best data in the world and are as transparent, and they create the beautiful integrated reports and ESG reports. And when you take a little bit, you scratch a bit below the surface, it doesn't look as good as they say. So BlackRock did a survey last year in July that was really, really insightful. Okay, they said that from 2011 to 2019, that the number of companies reporting to the S&P components moved from 10% to 90%, which is positive. But they said of the 90% of the companies that are reporting in 2019, we're reporting 50% of them cited that their lack of access to accurate data and reliable data analytics was the thing that was hamstringing them in furthering and deepening their investment into ESG and climate response. And this poor data quality is something we see every day. I mean, in South Africa, we deal with a lot of the JSE listed companies, and most companies today are still actually doing all of the stuff on spreadsheets, which we know are not an enterprise tool. We know it causes problems, but companies over the last 10 years have actually been procrastinating. They have been taking a wait and see attitude. They've been ticking boxes, and they'll actually have underinvested into the infrastructure, the tools, the resources to actually manage this properly. So they're trying to play catch up now. There's an urgency now, and they are basically behind the curve in terms of dealing with this. So data remains the key challenge. Up until now, what we've really had to rely upon was the noble efforts of quite a few of these organizations that you see. These are certification bodies that are dealing with certain verticals in the supply chain. Some of them, I can't, I'm a little bit sarcastic about it. I call some of them noddy badges because it makes people feel better about their consumption choices. Some of them are really, really good and robust, and I really wouldn't say bad things about them, but some of them, for example, some certain things in the marine and the fishing industry, if you watch watch those documentaries, that on, I forget the name of the documentary on the fishing, they said there's no such thing as sustainable fishing, not as long as 50% of all fishing is being conducted by illegal fishermen. And the bycatch, etc., there's just not enough visibility. You just can't see. So it's a real problem, and it's something that needs to be overcome with new solutions, okay? Because these are the things that are working, but at the same time, they are not working as well as they should. I just want to make mention of one of these badges here, the slave-free chocolate. I mean, isn't that an indictment on our species that we have to have a badge called slave-free chocolate? That it actually is a lot more expensive than normal chocolate because it actually takes into consideration a layer of overheads called wages that to pay the generally youth and slave labor that's happening predominantly in West Africa, Ghana, etc. And a lot of the chocolate that we eat in terms of cocoa that's coming from that region is being picked by slaves. And these are some of the problems that the trade finance companies have in terms of financing these supply chains, because, and particularly in Africa, where we have experienced serious exploitation for many centuries now. So slave-free chocolate is a thing, and there are many other things that affect Africa as well in terms of these things that around fair trade, etc., that haven't really worked. The whole slave chocolate thing has been going on. There was a documentary made in 2010 called The Dark Side of Chocolate. They haven't solved any of these problems. So we need a better way. So this is a guy that said it best, and no one has ever said it better since him. Peter Drucker, he actually said you can't manage what you can't measure, and added some words afterwards. You can't improve what you can't measure. You can't change what you can't measure. You can't do anything unless you measure it, basically. And up until now, that's been okay if companies have got away with doing things in the way they've been doing things, because, as I said, it's been a tick box exercise. And during this period of this wave growing, we've had early innovators, early adopters that have sort of got ahead of the curve. You always have that pattern happening with the diffusion of innovation, and they've done it better. But we've got a lot of people, a huge tail of laggards that are actually very, very vulnerable at the moment and feel quite overwhelmed by the situation, because it's not an easy thing to move a big ship and change your business model effectively and start integrating things that, prior to this, were not internalized. Externalities like carbon, like human exploitation, like all these things that haven't been internalized into the commercial equation. So the last 2 years has been very interesting. We've seen a tsunami of activity in terms of net zero. I mean, every company around the world, all our clients are driving science-based targets, net zero targets. ESG has become a massive thing that everyone's trying to get their head around. And you know, why did it happen now in the last 2 years? And I have to go back to a discussion I had with someone that probably everyone knows. He's a South African gentleman by the name of Mervyn King. He was basically the grandfather of integrated reporting globally. I mean, for your information, South Africa is actually very advanced and is a gateway to Africa. It's a very advanced country in terms of integrated reporting and carbon reduction. Integrated reporting because it was born here. Okay, so we take it very seriously. And we also take it seriously because of our legacy. We have a legacy of human rights abuses, etc. So we try and we take it seriously on the ESG side, especially the social side. But then also on the carbon side, going back, I think it was Bob's presentation earlier, he spoke about the most carbon intensive countries in the world. And there we were, the 12th, I think it was, carbon intensive per capita, I think it is. And that's a problem, especially if we don't have a just transition that was referred to earlier. You know, we're going to have cross-border adjustments that's going to make our products and services prohibitive. So we take carbon reduction, net zero very seriously. Also, we've got a monopoly in terms of a very, very carbon, fossil fuel intensive energy supply. And these guys aren't getting their act together. In fact, we're just lucky to have the lights on at the moment. I had to really see where I was going to be doing this presentation because in Cape Town in South Africa, we've got load shedding. So there's other priorities around this, but we're trying our best and companies are trying their best to actually drive net zero in a very disabling environment, which is really, really noble. So South Africans are trying to do their best. So what are the solutions here? Okay. There's two things, okay, and we're very involved in both of these things because we're always trying to find a way to take our clients on a journey of continuous improvement, right? We want to see them improving their data confidence because I've got an accounting background, and since I started this business back in 2007, I've been horrified by the little regard that has been paid to the accuracy of data and actually what it means. It's, you know, when I say it's been a box ticking exercise, you know, it's been around disclosure, but even to the point where there's disclosure risk. Okay, companies really haven't given it much regard until recently, when actually they're saying, "Oh, these numbers mean something," and it's a lot to do has got to do with why they're not ready for it is because it's all it's mostly non-financial data, right? And the problem with this is every company's got enterprise systems and ERP systems that deal with financial management and accounting. They've got generally accepted accounting practice. But when it comes to this non-financial stuff, they're saying, hold on, this is a fragmented market. There's no one unified way of bringing it together. Where do we start? Where's our guidance? And it's all non-financial data that's not captured in our ERP systems. What do we do? So this whole digitalization and this digital transformation story is very exciting, especially for us in South Africa. It gives us the agility. We've built a software as a service platform that is extremely agile, that we can actually configure our systems around our clients' needs exactly to deal with the investor financier issues, to deal with their compliance issues, and to deal with their performance management issues. And that's the continuous improvement we drive with our clients to data confidence, data automation, and then driving a positive impact in their business. And using digitalization, you know, big data were combined with Internet of Things, distributed ledger technology of that we speak about often with blockchain, enables the flow of data to be digitized, verified, and tokenized. Okay, and we've seen how that can benefit us, particularly in the carbon world as well. But then we also have this ability to track and trace, which we've spoken about in prior talks as well, and that's really exciting. I mean, the ability to use satellite imagery to see how the biosphere is being enhanced through regeneration, etc., being able to use geofencing for tracking QR codes, drones, etc. And in Africa, we need this. We're going to need things because the data isn't always accessible. So that kind of technology is really, really exciting for us. So we desperately need this in Africa. We need to digitize Africa. And for me, this is something that we are at the forefront of. And combined with blockchain, makes it really, really, really exciting, because at the moment, the whole carbon story is very, very difficult. I mean, it's a difficult process. You know, you have the situation, companies mostly do this thing on an annual basis. They have it verified on an annual basis. We are dealing with situations where banks are using data from 18 months ago to make a decision about what they're about to finance in a company's supply chain. And that's just an untenable situation. So we're trying to use blockchain to make it, validation, verification of data, more on the fly, more frequent, more recent, to make it actually aligned with business transactions. And that's very, very interesting. The other thing that it does is it will obviously reduce the losses from counterfeits and gray market situations. And companies, I think, would be able to, if they can show this transparency in their supply chain, will definitely benefit from a better reputation, and they will definitely have a leg up over their competition, we're seeing it already, particularly in the diamond industry. We're seeing that companies are fetching higher prices for their diamonds if they can prove traceability across the supply chain. The other thing is this data needs to be made available to lots of people. So having ESG in the supply chain and having all the players together and having that data available to the different actors that are required for these transactions is actually the only way you can do it properly on the fly. Otherwise, we are stuck with having to find other ways. So the other thing that we have here in Africa, which is really, really exciting, which is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which I think 2019 came out. It's 55 nations across Africa deciding to reduce tariffs and to enhance intra-African trade. And it's a massive opportunity. I mean, let's not forget that Africa, which is generally always on two cylinders because of other interests coming and doing it, Africa's got huge potential. Africa has got a population of 1.3 billion. It is rising at an alarming rate, actually, but we've also got a GDP of over $3 trillion, which is huge. We've got a lot to work for. The issue is that we should be richer and we should be better off in Africa. There's no trickle down when there's growth in terms of the corporates that are coming in and doing things in Africa. That increase in growth is not trickling down to where it counts the most, to the people that are doing the work and that are living and that have always been here, to be quite frank. So we have got more arable land than the rest of the world. We've got more minerals than the rest of the world. The problem is that for the last, let's say, since the Industrial Revolution at least, but hundreds of years, our natural environment has been devastated by unethical and irresponsible companies coming in here and doing their thing. Our people have been exploited and enslaved. Our oil, our minerals, and our food have been exported outside of the country without adding any value at commodity prices. And this has got to stop. And I see this technology as a way of actually giving us our own sovereignty as a continent and actually being able to take control of our own destiny. So that's why, for myself, this whole thing, and to be able to get that visibility into supply chain so there isn't the shenanigans that's going on, so that we can stop the corruption and get more visibility, is something that actually is not just exciting, but is actually something we cannot do without. So into a couple of use cases, okay, I'm just going to talk about this for a second. So obviously agriculture, and we talk about the IPCC 6 assessment report that came out recently, which said basically we're so far gone in this climate crisis that we can't actually have carbon credits that are from reducing carbon emissions or from renewable energy anymore. Actually, the biggest thing that we need to do is we need to regenerate. We need to make sure that we can actually enhance the soil, because we're losing our topsoil. I mean, one of the biggest crises that we have is that by 2050, they're going to say we're going to have no topsoil, which will, reduce us to 3D printing and stem cells and lab meat and lab vegetables, etc. And that's not a nice place where we want to be. We want to use the natural systems. So, so things are, there's a problem there, and there's a lot of one of the most important ways in which smart contracts can actually bring everyday people into the fight against climate change is enabling regenerative agricultural programs and incentivizing communities around the world to reduce their carbon footprint. In Africa, we're saying we don't have to reduce. It's 2% of the world's carbon footprint, but at the end of the day, we can regenerate. Okay, and if we do that by planting trees and using ecological farming and doing things properly and conserving the land, we can enhance the biosphere and we can enhance the soil as well. And really what we would do there, Green World Campaign in collaboration with Cornell University have put together just a platform using blockchain to do that, using smart contracts, using satellite data that actually measures how much of the plant, the biosphere is actually regenerating, and then automatically rewarding the people who have become the custodians of that land for the good work that they've done in managing it responsibly and in a regenerative way. So you can have this thing almost seamless where people can just do things in a better way and they can benefit from this whole thing through carbon credits, and they can actually get that directly into their wallet using blockchain. The other thing that we look at here as well is something in fishing. We've got, let me see what goes on here. Sorry. The tuna industry, tunas fetch a huge amount of money today, but sometimes, we've got fishing clients in South Africa and we see what goes on. We see how sustainable they try to be in South Africa. We see how difficult it is because of the fishing practices, because of the reality of business. But we also know that there's a huge opportunity in fishing to be able to show traceability between the fishing company and the end user and the retailer. So World Wildlife Fund, WWF, Sequest Fiji, and Consensus, another blockchain network, have done this project where they want to stamp out illegal fishing. They want to show that there's traceability. They're using QR codes, and they're able to show how tunas, wherever they are caught, how they are caught, and they can verify actually where this fish came from, and this will be a premium product that will actually be, the consumers can be confident in actually consuming. The next one is diamonds. We're seeing this a lot. In Africa, we know as well, the whole blood diamond story, another excellent movie that we saw, a very sad movie, but something that continues, and we're seeing there's a couple of companies and the blockchain networks who are onto this whole traceability. Topple is one of these, where they are able to trace diamonds from their source right through to the end game. De Beers, one of the biggest diamond companies in the world, have done it from an end user perspective, and they've made sure that their whole blockchain, their whole supply chain is traceable and visible through their initiative called Tracker, TRACR, and for them, this is something that's incredibly important. And in fact, we've got another company that's also a diamond company in South Africa that's a client of ours, also going through this. And we're trying to get them to the point where we can actually also prove, show that the platform, the traceability is there, and that they can actually sell these diamonds with confidence to the end market. Another one is the agri-digital program, the grain monitoring. This is, knowing where your food comes from, the ingredients, is building consumer confidence, especially in a consumer conscious world. And the transparency of blockchain can actually establish that trust between the merchants, the sellers, the buyers, etc. So this Australian farming initiative with a whole lot of farmers uses technology to keep track of the buying, storing, and selling of grains between the farmers, the merchants, the corporations, and even stock traders. So very, very good initiative. Plastic Bank is quite an interesting one. I was speaking at a conference back in 2019 in Porto, in Portugal, at the Sustainable Brands Seas, Oceans conference. And Plastic Bank were well represented. I met David Katz there, who's an incredibly inspiring individual who started this organization. And in Africa, particularly South Africa, this is a massive topic. We've got a big waste division which help companies drive net zero waste to landfill. And we're trying to work out the data. We've worked out the data side. We've got the whole consulting piece, and we've got the engineering to help companies to get there enterprise-wide. So when we saw this, we actually saw this is actually a beautiful thing for Africa, because the better you do on the sustainability side, particularly in waste, where in Africa and many other Asian countries or emerging economies, a lot of people, livelihoods are dependent on that to pick that waste, they out of landfills or in informal settlements. So this now incentivizes, this was before, I met them before blockchain, but I'm so happy to see that they've actually embraced blockchain because it's the perfect thing. There's so many players. There's the pickers, there's the, trying to get the money back, the rebates from the actual recycling companies. There's a whole lot of moving parts here, and technology is the only way that Plastic Bank was able to scale their business and to be able to manage that through, rewarding people with incentives for doing the right thing. Finally, I'm done with my story. I hope I haven't gone too much over time, but finally, Heineken, this is a supply chain management story when one company is really trying to show traceability across their supply chain. Once again, it's QR codes, it's geofencing. They're able to do this. This is becoming very common now. And at the end of the day, you can see the whole product's entire journey from farm to bottle, from the hops and the picking of the hops right through to drinking a cold Heineken at home. So very, very exciting. So yes, in conclusion, we find ourselves in extremely exciting times, particularly in South Africa and Africa. We have the benefit of the latest and greatest in digital technology, free from the shackles of legacy systems that don't give us what we require in terms of intelligence and insight. We're able to leverage the power of blockchain to ensure greater security and transparency into our supply chains. We reduce exploitation of people and degradation of the environment that has been so endemic on the African continent, so that stakeholders can get a real truthful, honest information to inform their consumer decisions. I thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much, Andrea, for the opportunity to speak at your conference.
Thanks to you, by the way, Kevin. That was a great presentation, and you know how much I have in terms of love for the African continent, how much time I do spend in the past over there, so in particular in Southern Africa. So it's a great presentation. I thank you so much for being with us, sharing your insights and giving us a look that's on a continent that is often, let's say, outside of the highlight. So last but not least, I handle the torch to the last speaker today, Robin Clemens, my friend from Germany. It will give us a perspective on DeFi and carbon credits, carbon offsets. Robin, please take the stage. Stage is yours. Get the lead into this.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me today. Let me share my screen. Now you should see my slides, I guess. So I'm Robin, co-chair of the Hyperledger Climate Action Accounting Special Interest Group and founder of Kumo. And this presentation will be about Kumo today. In the first half, we'll take a closer look at the challenges of supply chains. And in the second part, we will talk about Kumo and how green stablecoin can address global challenges like climate change. First, I want you to meet Bob. Bob is 45 years old, lives in Barcelona, and he's working in the supply chain sector for over 20 years. He has seen supply chains growing in complexity, frequency, and internationality. Everything is interconnected now. Just-in-time approaches decrease the inventory in warehouses, and suppliers and sub-suppliers change on a daily basis. Digitalization is a key focus of Bob's company strategy, but still the supply chain is run on spreadsheets, and the scanner is Bob's best friends. With that in mind, let's take a look at the regulatory requirements that soon become an additional layer of complexity in Bob's work. Many of you have heard about European Green Deal, and it has also already been mentioned in today's presentation. In short, it's Europe's approach to addressing climate change and environmental degradation. On Europe's path to net zero, I want to highlight one recent proposal that affects the supply chain industry. In February this year, the EU adopted a proposal for a directive on corporate sustainability due diligence. The proposal provides for companies' due diligence duties to identify, prevent, end, or mitigate adverse impacts of their activities on human rights, and the second is on the environment. And this not only applies to companies' own operations, but also to their subsidiaries and their entire value chain. Companies are also required to have a plan to ensure that their business model and strategies are compatible with the limiting of global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, in line with the Paris Agreement. The European Commission estimates that around 13,000 companies based in the European Union and another 4,000 additional non-EU companies will be covered by the directive scope of applicability. Looking at Bob's job and the new regulations, Bob might be asking himself, how can I find the time to reach this additional goal? But the question we are asking at Kumo is, how can Bob reach this goal without investing any additional time? We want to make Bob drive climate action without adding another task to his already busy to-do list. So one thing that is part of every supply chain and every market is money. I want you to think about the following just for a couple of seconds. What if we could turn the act of using money into climate action? Thereby, Bob could fulfill the EU requirements on an everyday basis by using money as usual without having a single additional task. And that's what Kumo is all about. We make climate action possible for everyone who wants to stay in their comfort zone. We offer the very first stablecoin that is backed by nature. And how do we do that? We use tokenized carbon credits as collateral to mint KUSD, which is a stablecoin and stands for Kumo US dollar. First, I want to explain how Kumo works on a high level before diving into the protocol itself. We will go back in time a little bit when gold and silver coins were used as commodity money. The problem back there was that coins were heavy and the gold coins could just be stolen. Thereby, the goldsmiths took the advantage and allowed people to deposit their gold in their already existing vaults. In return, the depositor received a paper receipt for the amount of gold. The paper receipt were quickly accepted as payment because the paper receipt were much handier and gold remained in the vaults. Our protocol works on a high level in a very similar way. People can deposit carbon tokens into our protocol. Then they can borrow a stablecoin, which is called KUSD, against the locked carbon tokens. Now they can use the received stablecoin as a means of payment, like paper receipts were used at the time of gold coins. Next, I want to take a closer look at our collateral, especially carbon credits. The voluntary carbon market is a marketplace for certified carbon credits, where each carbon credit represents 1 metric ton of CO2. Carbon credits either remove CO2 from the atmosphere or they avoid emissions. The idea behind the voluntary carbon market is to value nature's ecological services and to create a financial incentive for projects that take care of our planet. It offers a very efficient way to create a money stream for projects with the highest ecological impact. Carbon credits are generated by project developers that reduce greenhouse gas emissions by projects such as planting trees, building biogas plants, or by protecting the Amazon rainforest from deforestation. The projects can then get certified by external and independent auditors according to well-established standards like the Verra standard or the gold standard. The certified carbon credits can then be sold on a voluntary carbon market. And typical buyers of these carbon credits are corporations that want to offset their carbon. Their company carbon footprint, like Microsoft, Alphabet, Disney, and more and more. Also, we as individuals can purchase these carbon credits either directly on online marketplaces or by ticking the checkbox to offset the emissions of your flight when booking your next trip. Now let's come to the protocol. We maintain an over-collateralized borrowing protocol, and we enable borrowing the KUSD stablecoin against tokenized carbon credits with no interest rate. The borrowing starts with carbon tokens. These carbon tokens are just digital representations of the carbon credits from the voluntary carbon market that I've presented before. The carbon credits are transferred to the on-chain world. They are bridged as ERC20 tokens to carbon bridges like the one from Token Protocol. The carbon tokens can then be acquired like every ERC20 token in the DeFi space. So next, holders of carbon tokens can open a vault in the Kumo borrowing protocol and deposit their carbon tokens as collateral. The protocol maintains the peg of the KUSD to the US dollar by being over-collateralized and by liquidating under-collateralized vaults. This is a very important thing. Over-collateralized means that the dollar value of the locked carbon tokens always exceeds the dollar value of the minted stablecoin KUSD. Finally, users can now borrow KUSD against their collateral and swap money into climate action. Let's come back to Bob and see how Kumo helps him. The only thing Bob needs to do is to switch from fiat money or fiat currencies like euro or US dollar to KUSD, which at easiest is just another form of digital money or digital currency. Now comes the magic. If Bob holds 1,000 KUSD, which is equivalent to 1,000 US dollar, his bank account's balance does not only just represent the monetary value anymore. Instead, it additionally reflects 1 ton of carbon offsets, giving a price of $10 per carbon credit. Bob can now use his bank statement to prove compliance with the EU requirements without any additional effort, thanks to the transparency and accountability of blockchain systems. If we all use KUSD instead of fiat money, we can simply save the world by doing business as usual. With the help of Kumo, businesses contribute to the Paris Agreement and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. With the help of Kumo, businesses prevent and mitigate adverse impacts on the environment and can easily account for their positive impacts just by using KUSD. If this sounds great to you and you want to contribute to our vision, then you should take part in our pilot program. We would love to cooperate with you and to protect planet Earth by merely switching to green money. We can only solve climate change as a collective and if we work together. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Robin. This is indeed very interesting topic. And I would say last but not least is a very interesting one. And I thank you so much for your insights, your contribution to the debate. And well, thank you so much from my side to you and to the rest of the speakers. It was a great one. Eric, I'll leave it on to you to close down the meeting. We're now exceeding 2 hours meeting. So I think I'll leave it on to you to do so.
So real quick, again, thank you very much, everybody, for showing up today. Thank you very much for our speakers. Andrea, merci beaucoup. It was a great event, a lot of great content, a lot of great questions. We will send out the recording. This was live streamed, but we'll follow up with an email with presentations, make these slides available to everyone and make the recording available to everyone. Yeah. So give us a couple of days and we'll send that out probably early.
Just a final note on my side, Rick, I wanted to announce the fact that one of the speakers today, Bob Havestein, will join me in this venture, BSCA Europe, a strategic consultant. You know how much we're focusing to the ESG and sustainable development goals. So welcome Bob to the family. We will announce this joining, you see, during the next few days. Recordings are, you see, we live cast this meeting on all social media. So stay tuned because we're gonna go for more of this. And we have another one ready in the pipeline coming soon in 2 weeks' time. It's gonna be, let's say, a short version. Glad to see you again.
So thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, Kevin.
Ciao, ciao, Andrea. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Robin.